Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to this week's international webcast featuring our founder and chairman, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Over the last weeks, Helga has been emphasizing the deployment by British imperial geopolitical interests out to wreck the promising potential that's emerged in Eurasia, and especially around the recent developments of a potential peace agreement with North Korea. Helga's repeatedly emphasized that this looks a lot like sleepwalking into World War I. And in fact, with the events that just took place in Gaza in the last couple of days, the massacre there by Israeli soldiers, the threat for the situation to break out of control, obviously, Helga, it looks like this is a potential pre-war kind of deployment to disrupt the emergence of this four-power agreement.
Yes, I think what has happened around Gaza in the last days is really a tragedy. Obviously it coincided with the opening of the US Embassy in Jerusalem, which I think was an unnecessary and provocative thing to do. But, the situation in the Gaza is really it's an open-air jail. It's a new Warsaw ghetto. If you look at what has happened there, I mean, okay, I'm not excluding that there are some violent Hamas elements who use the fact that, people are generally upset about the conditions. I mean, basically, you have a very tiny area of the size of, the city-state of Bremen in Germany, which is very small, where 2 million people are crowded. They have basically no money for food. They have only a few hours electricity. They have no clean water and no medical supply, which now, after 61 people were shot and 2,700 wounded, became a real nightmare, because you had all these wounded people who were not treated. So, people have been demonstrating, and the Israeli IDF and special snipers shot into the crowd, which was completely unnecessary. If you want to dissolve a crowd, you can use water throwers, you can use, such other means. You don't have to shoot people dead. So this has inflamed the situation. And, as I said, after a day of mourning and funerals, now the thing is not stopping. The Israelis are firing airstrikes at installations of the Hamas in Gaza. So this could easily lead to, an escalation where you have a war between Israel and Hamas, Hezbollah, and potentially Iran, and then from there it goes to a big war. So this is a terrible situation. And, I should remind people, that what is happening in this area, even so it's not in the spotlight of the mass media. When you had the Oslo Agreement, which was in 1993, already at that time, the Palestinians were supposed to get only 25% of the territory of Palestine, and the Israelis would get 75%. But in the meantime, 60% of the so-called West Jordan land has been occupied by settlers. So there are only 40% left. And, this is really becoming a very dire situation. And obviously the aim is, and several people have said that the aim is to demoralize the Palestinians in such a way that they give up and just quit, which won't happen. I mean, you have a situation where the Jewish population is becoming quickly a minority, and you cannot maintain rule over a hostile population which is outnumbering you in such ways. You saw that in other occasions, like in South Africa, it didn't function, and it will not function here. So, even if you don't have an escalation to a big war, you have hell. And I have been saying this, and not naturally, my husband has been saying it since decades. You need economic development, because if you have a lot of young people in Gaza and elsewhere, who are growing up being 14, 15, 16, and already at that time have the feeling they have no future. I mean, it is, a chain of violence, an escalation of violence is pre-programmed. So we have been making the point the whole time that, while you have Christian fundamentalists in the United States who think that an early Middle East war is a good thing. I have heard such people talking like that. I mean, the reality is that the Middle East, Southwest Asia has been the playground of British imperialism and at a certain point also French imperialism, which, basically have treated this region as a region for proxy wars for their own geopolitical interests. This was demonstrated in the Sykes-Picot Treaty of 1916, which, basically carved up this region in ways which was the seed for future conflicts. And right now, you can see very clearly that, the aim is to get a confrontation with Russia, Iran, but Russia, China, and that way, prevent the possibility of a cooperation in a new paradigm. So my husband has said this many times. Emphatically, he has made speeches about it at international fora, that the only way how you can break this terrible nightmare of violence and horror is by having a four-power agreement between the United States, Russia, China, and India. And that way, you have enough people and enough military, political, and economic power to basically end the British Empire and their ability to manipulate the situation. Now, this has to be put on the agenda, because if it's not, the danger is that this thing spirals out of control. And, already now it's a terrible nightmare and tragedy for the people who are suffering these situations.
You mentioned the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was a perfect example of the British geopolitical deployment that led to World War I, and then the immediate period afterwards, where the British were moving in to try to replace the collapsing Ottoman Empire and establish what we call the Middle East today, or what the British called the Middle East, a bridge that they could control between Asia, Africa, and Europe. Now, these geopoliticians are on the march. They're threatening. You have in Israel threats against Lebanon, Israeli strikes on Iranian positions in Syria. But Helga, I think the important thing for people to understand is your emphasis and your husband's emphasis on a bigger picture agreement, which would be that of the great powers. None of these smaller states can maneuver effectively within this. How is it that you could get an agreement? I mean, isn't this a perfect opportunity for Trump and Putin to get together and sit down and talk about it?
Yes, I think that particular move to, they did agree on the telephone to have an early summit. President Trump even invited Putin to come to the White House. And, given the extremely difficult factional situation in the United States and, the anti-Trump Russiagate coup attempt, which is now completely falling apart, but it's still not, officially acknowledged, and it needs to be gotten through in terms of putting the culprits for this coup on trial instead. Given these difficult and complex situations, I think if this summit between Putin and Trump would take place as quickly as possible and take all the time needed to discuss and develop flanks to the situation, I think that is the one thing which could cut through all of this and create new options. So I really think we should all wish and speak out that such an early summit would occur.
Now, we also see the great potential on the Korean Peninsula somewhat set back by these comments by Bolton, the national security advisor, comparing North Korea to Libya, which is an unmistakable reference for anyone in North Korea that the threat that was when Gaddafi went along with an agreement to get rid of his nuclear weapons. Less than a decade later, Obama, Cameron, Sarkozy, and Hillary Clinton went in and destroyed the country. What's your sense of where things stand now following this statement from North Korea, the cancellation of the North Korea-South Korea summit that was supposed to take place, I think, today? What's your sense of where this is heading?
Well, I think it is, in a dangerous phase. It's not yet hopeless, because after this North Korea South Korea summit was cancelled, the State Department basically said the United States still assumes that the summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un will take place on the 12th of June in Singapore. And there were rumors in the Japanese papers that maybe even Xi Jinping would participate in such a summit. So this is not yet off the table. And the deputy foreign minister of North Korea, his name is Kim Ki-kwan. He made a very clear distinction between, the statements and the line of Pompeo and Trump. Pompeo, when he was in North Korea, came back and reported very respectful and very positive about Kim Jong-un, and Trump clearly has taken up a very respectful tone towards Kim Jong-un as well. However, Bolton and this deputy foreign minister made this distinction very clearly. Bolton, I don't know if it's just uncleverness or deliberate, I have no way of saying it, but to tell the North Koreans that the model of the denuclearization proposal by Kim Jong-un will follow the Libya model. I mean, you cannot say something worse, because if you remember, Libya, Gaddafi turned over all of Libya's nuclear weapons, and then the result was he was overthrown and killed, and the country is in chaos ever since, basically ungovernable to the present day. So this deputy foreign minister basically said that, that they will never accept such a model, obviously, and that that North Korea is basically proposing something which is not to be taken as a weakness, but it is actually an effort by Kim Jong-un to solve a very untenable, terrible situation. But it's not a sign of weakness. And it cannot be done by unilateral commands from the side of the United States, but it has to occur in a trustful atmosphere of dialogue and cooperation. So since I think that President Trump is intending to do that, I don't think it's completely in danger. But there is clearly a cloud over the horizon, and obviously the events in the Middle East also have a peripheral impact, namely the question, which is being raised by many people, if the United States can rip apart the nuclear agreement with Iran, which was a negotiated agreement. It took 12 years. Many nations were involved. The United Nations approved it. So if you unilaterally get rid of such an agreement, then it also puts a question of doubt on the reliability of the United States in general. So I think all of this, means that we are really in a very dangerous situation. And for example, there was just a new poll whereby now 57% of all Russians are convinced that the crisis in Syria will lead to a global war. Now, I hope not, but the air is full of worry about war, and people who are concerned about this, they should really help us to mobilize, to bring in the alternative, which is the cooperation among nations for a win-win cooperation, overcoming geopolitics, And the potential clearly is there. I think a lot of good things have happened. The rapprochement between China and Japan, careful steps in this direction between China and India, clearly a good relation between Japan and Russia. Trump clearly has stated his intention to keep, despite all trade issues, a good relationship with his friend Xi Jinping, as he always calls him. And there is the pending summit between Trump and Putin. So all the potentials are clearly there. But it is also clear that as the Western financial system is in absolute mortal danger of a new blowout, the risks to the situation cannot be overestimated, and make every intervention in the direction of solving these problems with the 4 laws proposed by my husband extremely urgent. So I would call on all of you that you should get in contact with us. You should become a member of the Schiller Institute. You should help us to put the 4 laws of Lyndon LaRouche on the agenda, because they are not only needed in the United States, they are equally needed in Europe and other regions affected by the effects of the transatlantic financial system.
And I think this just highlights the difficulty of existing in between 2 paradigms. On the one side, you have the old geopolitical unilateralist paradigm, which is an imperial paradigm of war, of proxy wars, of false flags, of terrorism, of bailouts, of austerity. And that's being rejected by the world's population. But we haven't yet seen the full consolidation of the new paradigm. And that's what the work of the Schiller Institute has been from the beginning, to bring this new paradigm into existence. On that, also the Iran situation is sort of hanging between these 2 paradigms. It's not clear where that's going. But Helga, there's been some discussion among Europeans as to whether or not the agreement can be salvaged. What do you know about that?
Well, the Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif traveled to China. He traveled to Russia and then to Brussels, because all of these countries, that is Russia, China, Germany, France, and Great Britain, and the EU, basically have stated that they want to try with all possible means to maintain the Iran nuclear agreement, even if the United States pulled out unilaterally. Now, it is not clear if that will function. Naturally, the fact that Russia and China are backing it is a very important point. However, if the US would impose secondary sanctions on European firms who maintain business with Iran, I don't know what will happen, because the European Union representative Mogherini said that they will pull out some regulations which were voted in or accepted in the 90s, but they were never used to protect such firms from sanctions. Now, I have a hard time to imagine how that should function, given the fact that international banks are operating internationally. So if the United States would impose these secondary sanctions, it could cause absolute havoc in the whole situation. The Europeans have now said that they demand additional negotiations with Iran, this time not concerning the nuclear program, but concerning the Iranian missile program, which is also something which President Trump had meant. And he said all the time he would come up with a better deal. Well, I hope that this better deal is a comprehensive solution for the whole region. Now, we have discussed this many times, but I want to reiterate it, that if you want to solve the problem in the Middle East or in Southwest Asia, you have to take into account the security interest of every country and every single party. And that emphatically includes not only Israel, but it includes Iran, it includes the Palestinians, it includes every country. And equally important is that you need to have economic development. You have right now several situations which are turning into a nightmare. One is Yemen. You have the largest humanitarian catastrophe of the planet right now taking place in Yemen. You have the situation in the Gaza Strip, and naturally you have all the areas which have been destroyed by these wars. The situation in Afghanistan remains quite out of control, even so there are hopeful signs that this could be turned around. Now, what you need is, if you have a very complex situation like that, and obviously the many things which have happened, the many terrorism wars, emotions are hurt, people have an incredible accumulated rage. You need something big, and the only way how you could get it is if you had all the neighbors, Russia, China, India, Iran, Egypt, the United States, and hopefully European nations all agreeing that the only way how this can be solved is you have to have the extension of the new Silk Road into the region and develop every country as part of one integrated industrial infrastructure development program. Now, there are already beginnings of that. When President Xi Jinping was 3 years ago in Iran, he agreed already with President Rouhani at the time that the new Silk Road would be extended into Iran. You had the Afghanistan president, the Afghani president, demanding that the new Silk Road should be applied in Afghanistan. And at the recent Wuhan meeting between President Xi Jinping and Modi, they agreed that China and India would cooperate in bringing the Silk Road to Afghanistan by building, as a first step, a large train connection between Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Iran, China, and that way, start to connect Afghanistan to the Silk Road. Now, that same approach must be taken for Iraq, for Syria, for the situation in Yemen, and naturally, Egypt will have to play a very important role as a bridge between Asia and Africa. I think Egypt is absolutely thinking in this direction already. However, naturally, these are gigantic projects and they cannot be done by any one country alone. Even if China has a special envoy for Syria, they have said they want to play a leading role in the reconstruction of Syria. You have the earlier commitment of Russia to supply energy, of Iran to help in the industrial development. But that needs to be presented as a comprehensive proposal. And I'm sure that there are people in Israel as well who will not agree with the present course of Netanyahu, who, by the way, faces his own problems, and may look into not such a bright future for his own political career. That there are people in Israel who agree that you need to come out of this terrible paradigm of the present configuration. And if there would be an agreement between Trump, Xi Jinping, Putin, and Modi, and then other leaders joining with them to go in this direction, even this very difficult situation of Southwest Asia could be approached and a solution can be found. But it does require an extraordinary intervention.
Well, and just to inform our new viewers, and as well as to remind our regular viewers, we've produced that blueprint with the report that we've done on the new Silk Road coming into Africa and West Asia. And that's available through the Schiller Institute. And it is a comprehensive picture of what the Chinese have proposed and what they're actually already doing, moving the earth, creating jobs, educating people, doing the job training that's necessary. Now, as long as we're continuing to review the danger spots, there's one other one that won't go away, and that's the situation in Ukraine, where you had just this week the raid on the offices of RIA Novosti. You have various kinds of threats coming from Poroshenko and from the neo-Nazis and the security agencies in Ukraine. You also had this very interesting development of a new bridge opening from connecting Russia to Crimea, and this being a cause for some wild Ukrainian fascists calling for blowing up the bridge because this is an attack on Ukrainian independence. Helga, what's the situation on the ground as far as you can see in Ukraine right now?
Well, I think this raid on the offices of RIA Novosti is very serious because they arrested the office chief, Wyszynski. They compared RIA Novosti with Goebbels, and I mean, this is we're talking about the free press. You can really say that in Ukraine right now the situation is quite dire. Now, Mrs. Merkel, the German chancellor, will go to Sochi to meet with Putin, and this will be one of the subjects of discussion. Naturally, the other crisis spots as well. So, I think if one could somehow put pressure that the Minsk agreement is being put back on the table, which right now it is obviously not because Kiev is absolutely not cooperating, and you have the law by Poroshenko to solve the situation in East Ukraine with military means. So this is definitely another extremely dangerous situation. But, I think because it is so dangerous, I think more people are waking up to that, and that may be a first step to hopefully prevent something which could easily become World War III.
And the Ukraine issue brings up another aspect of Russiagate. I was just doing some review of this in the last couple of days, and I noticed that something I had forgotten, which is that John Brennan, the former CIA director, who was at the center of much of the operation of Russiagate against Trump, that Brennan made a secret trip to Kiev shortly after the overthrow of Yanukovych and put in motion U.S. support for the criminal regime that came in. So there's some new discussion coming up around Brennan in the Mueller case. This is quite interesting what Senator Rand Paul brought up. Helga, do you think this adds to the weight against Mueller? I mean, what the judges are turning against him. There are exposés of the FBI and overall corruption. Where is this thing heading? I mean, how come it hasn't been shut down by now?
Well, I think it could be shut down quickly because the latest twist is I just read an article that Mueller is now suspected of having had collusion with a Russian oligarch, which I find a little bit humorous if the situation wouldn't be so serious. But I think this letter by Senator Rand Paul is really important. He wrote a letter to Gina Haspel, the new head of the CIA, demanding that she should turn over every information the CIA has. Was there any investigation? Did the CIA bug the candidates, the presidential candidates of 2016, not just Trump, but every other candidate as well? And did they work, given the fact that the CIA is prohibited by law to survey Americans? Did they ask other intelligence services from other countries to cooperate with them in doing that? And then I think he hinted also to British intelligence directly. And then in an interview with NBC, he even went further and also brought up in this context the visit of Hannigan, the former head of CGHQ, the British equivalent of the NSA, to the United States, briefing Brennan about all of this. I mean, this is now coming out in the mainstream media that there was such a collusion with British intelligence. And I think this is, really a very good thing because obviously, this is completely illegal. It's unconstitutional. It may be even criminal. And the quicker these things are being followed up, the better. Also, Congressman Nunes, the head of the House Intelligence Committee, basically said that it's now 100% certain that there was absolutely no collusion of the Trump team with Russia. And he said, given the fact that those who pretended that there was such a collusion knew that it did not exist, why was this whole operation instigated in the first place? And I think this, question must be answered, because this was a coup attempt against an elected president of the United States. And it has shed light exactly who are the forces of the empire. We call it the British Empire because it is in the continuity of the British Empire. But all the people who have come out quickly against Trump on the side of those who accused him have also shown their true colors. So if the United States, should get back to its constitutional form, there were demands that the entire FBI and Department of Justice must be cleaned out and, reorganized afresh. I think all of this is necessary, and Trump must be freed from this, because this ongoing situation is the only reason why the relationship with Russia, with China, and naturally then in an indirect form in the Middle East, why these situations are so dangerous. So, if the world peace is supposed to be saved, the British coup must be uncovered completely. All the culprits must be held accountable. And then Trump can actually do what he promised he would do. And most of it actually went in a good direction. And even some of the critics have to see that. However, the one Damocles sword which is hanging over this is the danger of a financial blowout. And I think we need to really have this debate of not only Glass-Steagall, but go to Hamiltonian economics and applicate the 4 laws of my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, as an absolute urgent matter of priority.
And Helga, I think in conclusion, I'd like to pose something to you that comes back to this question of Hamiltonian economics, which is that as all these war provocations are progressing, as the British are pulling every string they have, the Chinese are continuing with the very bold plans around the New Silk Road. The New Silk Road spirit, as you called it, is catching around the world. And even the efforts of some to sabotage the US-China relationship around trade, around tariffs, things of that sort, seems to be moving in a potentially good direction with the visit of another team of Chinese officials to Washington. So how do you think this can affect the overall situation, the Trump-Xi relationship? Isn't that really one of the keys to breaking through into the new paradigm?
Yes, I think that, if the proposal by Li Keqiang, the Chinese prime minister, would be taken up, that the way to balance the trade between the United States and China is not by imposing tariffs, but by increasing trade, by increasing investments in third countries. That way it could be done in a much more elegant way. And there are plenty of opportunities. The United States could join with China in investments in Latin America, in, as I said already, the Middle East, in other Asian countries. And there is a new Chinese offer now to India that, rather than being a rival in African investment, that, given the fact that China has a big expertise in building infrastructure, where India is, really lagging behind, that they should join efforts, and India should bring in the kinds of things they can do well, and China would provide the large-scale structure without which all of these investments don't function. Now, for the United States, they could also be a part of that. And, I think that to look at the world in a non-geopolitical way, I know that this is almost impossible for some people to imagine, because they are so trained that the world is a zero-sum game, that, if China rises, the United States goes under. This is just not the case. The Chinese want to have the situation. China has made many times the point that they do not want to replace the United States as an unipolar, dominant force, but they want to have a new type of relations among major powers. And that involves dramatically the idea of joint economic projects in third countries, joint ventures, and redefine entirely how you go about it. I mean, if you look at it from a longer arc of history, it is not natural that people solve conflicts with weapons or wars. I mean, this is what I always call the infant diseases of mankind, like little boys who kick each other at the forelegs, when they are 4 years old or even 7 years old. Eventually, you can become adult and you can cherish the creative mind of the other person and work together like Max Planck and Einstein, like Schiller and Humboldt. You can have a relationship to other countries where you address the creative potential of the other, and that enriches in turn your own potential. I think that the future of humanity, which is after all the only species capable of creative reason, of making fundamental discoveries about universal principles of the physical universe again and again, and that way develop more knowledge about our planet, the universe in which we are living, about the principles of science and technology, which we then apply in the production process, which leads to an increase of productivity, which leads to an increase of living standard, an increase of longevity. I mean, this is what we are. We are not animals. We are human beings who, are the only species, at least known so far in the universe, which can relate to their creative power as their identity. And I think if we take that approach, then to have many nations and to have many cultures, all based on their cultural tradition, all based on their sovereignty, they can work together to a higher level of reason. And that is the only way how mankind will survive. I think we are at a crossroad. If we decide to stay with geopolitics, in this world, this will lead to World War III, and for all we know, the extinction of our species. On the other side, the new paradigm is already working. 140 countries are already cooperating. And I think we need a mass movement of people who say, mankind reached a new era and we must consciously form our future, our shared community for the future of mankind, as Xi Jinping always calls it. And I think we need a discussion. I said this many times, and now my voice is giving up.
Well, I think you've just made a compelling case for people to give up sleepwalking and to instead catch the new Silk Road spirit. So Helga, until next week, thank you. And thank you for joining us, and take up this challenge. Those of you watching this, take up the challenge to become active with the Schiller Institute. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.